camera, so please be on your best behavior.
Oh, God.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. I know that some of you are going to watch this. Some of you may listen, take notes. I suggest that you take notes. If you're going to take notes, let me give you a good suggestion. The fact that you're in centers doesn't stop you from taking notes with somebody else in class. And I suggest that what you do is you identify somebody that you feel is a good note taker and start a Google Doc with them. You take your notes, they take their notes, and then you have both notes to compare when you're preparing. Okay? I think that that's probably a good idea, and if you do that, the way that you're going to do it is you're going to get on Google Docs, you're going to start a document, and you're going to give the other person editing rights to the document. And that way, as you're taking notes or they're taking notes, you have both sets of ideas. Oftentimes, you may think that something is important, and they don't, but because you did, you wrote it down, and as they're studying, they get the benefit of that and vice versa. Yes, Joseph?
Okay.
And we're going to be starting on 558. Now, this particular section is titled Fight Over Reconstruction. Ladies and gentlemen, in truth, the fact that people stop fighting, physically fighting, doesn't end a disagreement. And we're going to examine that during the Civil War, but it has been true throughout history. The Palestinians and the Jews are not currently fighting, but their disagreement continues, and from time to time they start fighting again. The fact that you're now fighting doesn't end the disagreement. In the Civil War, the fact that the war, the fighting phase was over, didn't change the way people thought. Southerners, on the day after the war, didn't automatically believe that slavery was wrong. Southerners, after the war was over, didn't automatically believe that they were equal to African Americans or that the newly freed people should be free, for a variety of reasons. Now, today we're sitting here and we're looking back, and many of us judge them because it's easy for us to look at somebody's behavior and judge it, especially when we're doing this over time. A perfect example is the way that people think about Adolf Hitler. Don't get me wrong, Adolf Hitler, in my opinion, was a terrible human being. He was a terrible leader. But during the time of World War II, there was another gentleman by the name of Joseph Stalin. And he was the leader of, at that time, a country called the Soviet Union, which today, a large part of that is Russia. Joseph Stalin killed as many people as Adolf Hitler did. Joseph Stalin killed many innocent people for no reason at all. Yet today, when we look back in history, especially at this period of time, and you look at Adolf Hitler and you look at Joseph Stalin, nobody automatically says Joseph Stalin was the devil, the Antichrist, evil incarnate. They don't. Why? Well, because Joseph Stalin was on our side during World War II. And Adolf Hitler wasn't. That example teaches you a great lesson. And the lesson is this. Oftentimes, we in the future judge people based on who won the conflict, right? If Adolf Hitler had won the conflict today, you and I would be talking about the second coming of the devil, or the coming of the devil, or the Antichrist for Joseph Stalin, and we would have said Adolf Hitler was a great man. Because oftentimes history is written by the winners. And we in the future, since we weren't there, we depend on what other people wrote, what witnesses tell us about. And those witnesses are filtered by who won. So, at the end of the Civil War, the Southerners didn't automatically think, oh, by the way, slavery was evil. They didn't. Why do we? Because we have had the benefit of seeing the end of slavery. It doesn't affect us economically. We weren't raised in that system. So for us, it's easy to look back and judge and say that was terrible. But for them, it wasn't. Now, that doesn't excuse them. It doesn't excuse the institution. It just tells you that after the war, they were still in a position of, you won, but I still don't like you. Think about a baseball game, a volleyball game, a football game that you lose. Doesn't make you best friends with the other team. You don't want to, you know, when you shake hands, you're like, and then many times you go like this, rub your hand, because you don't like them. That doesn't teach, I'm not saying that that's good sportsmanship, but I am saying that the end of the conflict doesn't end the disagreement, and at the end of the war, there will continue to be disagreement between the North and the South, and in particular with regards to slavery. So, because the South wasn't convinced that the institution itself was evil, that the institution itself was wrong, they then began to do things within the new structure meaning now the North won, they're setting the rules. They're trying to create something within the rules that the North is giving them that to a certain extent allows them to utilize what they know. So a series of laws were passed, and those laws oftentimes were directed at, in a one way or the other, re-enslaving the Southern freedmen. Remember that one of the conditions for all of the plans that we talked about in the last section was that the South agreed that slavery was illegal. So they couldn't call it slavery. Slavery as an institution was gone. But there were other things that they could do. One diabolical plan from someone, they said, okay, slavery's gone. We can't recapture these people and call it slavery. But we can pass a law that says that everybody has to have a job. And if you don't have a job, you are a lawbreaker, a criminal. And if you're a criminal, we can arrest you, because that's what happens with criminals. And if we arrest you, we can sentence you to jail, and in jail we can have you do whatever it is that we want you to do, because you're in jail. So, who didn't get jobs? African Americans. African Americans that didn't have jobs, they were arrested. They're not made slaves, now they're criminals. And because they're criminals, their services are then sold to the highest bidder. Sounds an awful lot like slavery, but it is using the rules that the North prepared. They can't call it slavery. You can't own somebody indefinitely. But at the same time, they're taking advantage of the language of slavery. So you begin to see a lot of that. You begin to see resentment. And what is resentment? Well, you see a game on television that the team you really like, and your team loses a close game. And you resent the umpires. Man, they were sold. Did you see that? They didn't call that one, and they called this one, and they were wrong. To a certain extent, that's resentment. Okay? That's a lack of acceptance of losing. And that's human nature. Not right. It's not good sportsmanship. But to a certain extent, it's human nature. Why do I say it's human nature? Because we see it all around. Am I wrong? Have you not seen it in your experience? Have you not seen it? Haven't you been watching a game and heard somebody say, oh, el referee está vendido? Right? We've seen it because to a certain extent it's part of human nature. Doesn't make it right. But after the war in the South, there was that human nature of we should have won, and the people at fault were the African Americans. And white people began to gather together to kind of commiserate and talk about it and complain about it and discuss it. And out of that energy, the Ku Klux Klan was created. Ku Klux Klan was a terrible, diabolical organization of, at the beginning, former Confederate soldiers. They just put KKK. Okay? It doesn't matter. KKK. We'll run into it in the book. Now, they're former Confederate soldiers. And you need to pay close attention because these former Confederate soldiers utilized, or perhaps even introduced into the world, I'm not sure, something that we are struggling with today, and that's called terrorism. Terrorism. What is terrorism? The using of terror to intimidate and kind of put people in their place. Think about it. People in the Middle East are afraid of going to public places. Why? Because there's a possibility that somebody's going to blow themselves up and you with them. People in the Middle East are fearful of going in a public bus because you could be stopped and shot. It isn't that every person in a public bus is stopped and shot, but because it's happened, that terror affects people's behavior. The Ku Klux Klan used terror to affect people's behavior. And this is what they did. And it is to a certain extent diabolical. They targeted African Americans. Oftentimes, when they targeted a family, they would leave at night a burning cross in front of their house. That burning cross meant you've had it. Oftentimes after that, the person would be found hung from their head on a tree and left to hang there so that all of the neighbors could go by. Imagine finding that. It creates terror. That's an early form of terrorism. And today we're actually seeing it in other places of the world. So let me tell you that we Americans are innovators. We came up with guerrilla fighting. That doesn't mean that guerrillas fought. It means that we hid behind trees and we shot at people rather than conventional warfare, which is technically called guerrilla warfare. We came up with the concept of total war. Remember, William Tecumseh Sherman, he believed that everybody in a war was a participant, whether you were a soldier or his wife. If you were on the other side, you are not going to be pardoned from the pain. And now, we in the United States came up with terrorism. Aren't we great? Aren't we great? Which tells you that out of great things, and I do think that the United States is a great country with great people, out of great things, sometimes bad things come out. I'll give you a perfect example. Adolf Hitler wrote 2 books. One is very famous. It's called Mein Kampf. That's in German. It means my struggle. He published it. Put your hand down. He published it, and a lot of people read it, and you can still buy it and read it. It's his story from his point of view. A lot of it is garbage, but it's his point of view. But he wrote a second book that very few people know about because it wasn't published. In his second book, which was intended to be published after he won, and the reason that it wasn't published is because in it he gives his motivation for what he did. Okay, he didn't want his enemies to know his motivation during the war, but it was getting ready to be published after the war. And when we study World War II, you'll find out that World War II was almost won by Adolf Hitler within days of starting. It took a long time, but he almost won the entire war very quickly. So he sets out to write his book, and in his book he says that one of the motivations for his behavior, that the powerful could do whatever they wanted with the weak, was the North American treatment of the Native Americans. North Americans wanted their territory. They were there. They were more powerful. They kicked the Indians out of there. Okay? So Adolf Hitler himself uses the Americans as an example. Again, doesn't make the United States a bad place. It means that out of something that we're complex, we have the possibility of being good, and we also have the possibility of being bad. And that's why we learn these things in the classroom, so that you learn to choose the good from the bad. Okay? Now, after the war, there was that hatred that exists when you lose and you don't accept. Poor sportsmanship. But at the same time, it really affected the